Hello, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thanks for joining me for this IPA talk. Grateful to have with me Deputy Executive Director, General Counsel Brian Schwartz, and our Government Public Relations Director, Allison Maley. So we are kind of at, I don't know, I guess you can call it halftime because it's, when all the bills have now, by their own calendar, have had to get across to the other chamber from both the House and the Senate. So we've got both chambers now. Today's date's April 14th. They're both kind of in recess for a bit. Thank goodness. Everybody take a break, take a nap, get a shower, whatever, get geared up for the next run at it here. So thought this would be a good time to record an IPA talk here and discuss kind of where we lay with things moving forward and what it is that we're going to be seeing continuing to move in the weeks ahead. So Allison, I know we won't be able to hit them all because there's still plenty out there, but thought it would be important to hit the highlights. So you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the elementary discipline proposal from the State Board of Education. We have made a lot of progress in the last week, even. We are still waiting for new language. We had a meeting with the Senate sponsor, Leader Kim Lightford, late last week, and we're still waiting for some language from ISB in response. So we are hopeful that we can kind of land in a place where hopefully IPA and other advocacy organizations, including the IEA and other school management groups, can hopefully be neutral on that. So I don't want to give too many details away since we're still kind of in negotiations, but we're hopeful that we can land in a good spot eventually. The companion House Bill 3772, sponsored by Representative Will Davis, it did pass the House. It was not amended. Well, it had a minor amendment, but nothing that would change all that substantially. It passed with a narrow majority in the House late last Thursday, 62 to 45. So bills had to get a 60 vote majority to pass. So 62 votes was a pretty slim majority. So I think all that being said is probably a good indication for us to be successful in trying to make some changes. Because I don't think that there was, again, a lot of broad support outside of the Democratic caucus to get that done. So stay tuned for some more changes, hopefully, and we'll go from there.
Well, and I think just to manage expectations here, Allison, it's in our estimation, it's still probably not going to be perfect, but it is. We have made a lot of good progress and some headway, and appreciate all the stakeholders' engagement on this, which have sometimes been some hard conversations. So grateful for that. But I think at the end of it, we should have something that'll help us, really still do what's best for students and keep that at the focal point. So grateful for all that good work there. What else?
So I guess continuing on the order of the ISB agenda, so Senate Bill 1519 was an initiative of two organizations, actually. So ISB had this on their agenda to prohibit ticketing in schools for especially high school students. And then there's another organization called the Debt-Free Justice Coalition. So the legislation that a couple of different organizations had sponsored kind of got married up together, and we had a lot of input in that process as well. So the final product, at least for now, Senate Bill 1519, it requires school districts that have SROs, so school resource officers, to have a memorandum of understanding with their local law enforcement agency that's supplying that SRO, just to kind of, put more details into specifying and defining that role of the SRO, talk about the training requirements that they need to do, which SROs already have to do training requirements through the state. And then talks about the review and evaluation of that SRO, including the community and stakeholder input. It requires school districts to report the same information on law enforcement referrals that districts are already reporting to the Department of Education and the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, so long as that still exists. So that same reporting, so there's not duplicate reporting. So the same reporting we're already doing for the feds would also be sent to the state. So again, same format, so it shouldn't be too different or too much of a burden to just send that to a second location. And then also prohibits, the big piece of it is it does prohibit SROs or other school personnel from issuing tickets or citations for municipal code violations on school grounds during school hours. So those are typically those tickets for vaping, fighting, disorderly conduct, things like that. So those would be prohibited. But SROs and other local law enforcement could still do what they would normally do for criminal offenses as well. So, the idea being that, to try to find other ways of diversionary tactics for those, offenses that might occur, vaping, fighting, those types of things, outside of issuing a student a ticket that usually results in a fine of some sort. And then, obviously can be a financial burden on some families. So again, it's one of those things that, we kind of had to agree to disagree at some points, but I think that probably that makes the most sense it still allows law enforcement to do their job when it comes to criminal violations. But it does put some restrictions on what happens with those municipal ordinance violations that might occur on
Allison,
school
how far
grounds.
does that extend in terms of school events or even school that's conducted via Zoom or other platforms?
Yes, so it would be during, I guess, Zoom hours, if you want to call it, but it's really meant for on school grounds during school hours. So again, if you have a situation that occurs after school at a, athletic event or another activity or something like that, that's after hours, SROs could still take those actions at that time, but just kind of putting those guardrails on during the school hours and on school grounds.
Yep.
Well, my recommendation would be, to school leaders is just be commonsensical about this. I really think that will prevail in most cases. When I think about my time as a high school principal and getting the authorities involved, it really had to be very egregious. It had to be assault or a weapons or drugs related issue or whatever that was very clearly a criminal violation that needed to be dealt with so that you make sure you're obviously keeping your school safe, a safe environment for kids to be. But and I can understand a little bit of the frustration as you're dealing with maybe a chronic vapor. And I'm like, well, I've tried everything else. What do I do here? Other than maybe a ticket or whatever. So I do recognize a little bit of the frustration that may come as a result of that. But as we're dealing with this legislative process, we've got to make the best of it. And I think, through your work and working well with the advocates, on the other side, particularly like Stand for Children comes to mind here. I think you've worked out a pretty reasonable solution overall. One question, Brian, I had for you with regards to this conversation, with regards to SROs and MOUs, I think a lot of school districts are already doing that to a certain degree, right? I mean, have you done any work with school districts on that, on the legal side of things?
Yeah, I think a lot of school districts are already doing that in terms of communication, which is positive. It just makes sure that school resource officers know what their expectations and obligations are. And then I think the other thing that has helped is the school resource officer training done by the Illinois training board, police training board, in addition to just the juvenile training. I think that's been helpful in making sure that school resource officers understand that their job is to be a resource at the school, not to enforce criminal laws at the school.
Right, right. Absolutely. Great. Okay, Allison, those are a couple biggies. A few other things that you've kind of been tracking closely on your list.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of talk about the Homeschool Act, and as of now, and we did not take a position on that. Our role as school officials for principals was very, very limited, if any. In fact, once it was amended, there was no role for schools themselves to participate in that or accept forms of any kind. But it did not receive a final vote in the House. It was sent back to rules last Friday. So, imagine that the sponsor, Representative Costa Howard, I'm sure wants to maybe revisit that in future years. But as for now, that seems to be dead. And of course, I'll put this out to our members as well. Nothing is ever dead in Springfield until June 1st, and maybe not even then.
Yeah.
Language can always be adopted onto, the budget implementation bill or put in some sort of an omnibus bill before the end of the year. But I think these larger issues, would be unusual for those larger issues to kind of be slipped into something at the last minute, just because there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of strong feelings, especially on that one, for that to be kind of thrown in toward the end. And another one too, I wanted to mention, especially for our members, along with the discipline bills, especially the elementary school discipline bills, I think the witness slips that you all have put out there for us when we have requested those, and the emails that you've sent, the phone calls that you've made, have really made the difference on a couple of these pieces of legislation. The other one being the PE waivers. So there was legislation, House Bill 1358, sponsored by Representative Chung from the Bloomington area. It would have limited districts to a one-time, non-renewable 3-year waiver for PE, and that's it. So there were other restrictions on some of the other waivers that are available, but at this point, the bill did not receive a final vote in the House, and so it was referred back to the Rules Committee. Again, I think that's another one that would be pretty significant to kind of try to slip in at the last minute before the end of May. So thanks to everyone for getting involved and sending those witness slips and making those phone calls and emails. Appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. Appreciate those updates, Allison. Now, Brian, I know you've received some questions from folks about a few pieces of legislation that's moved through. Just kind of curious about the most immediate impact related to these with special ed, right to play. You mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. There's certainly a lot going on there. We might have to add a third volume to the
to the school code.
school code.
Oh,
no.
At some point.
Yeah.
But the first bill that I've gotten a lot of questions on is Senate Bill 408, which passed the Senate by a vote of 56-0, and deals with special education records. And it's really interesting because I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that special education records are temporary records. So there was a movement to put all the special education records into a permanent record, which then school districts would have to maintain for 60 years, just so students, parents would have access to those documents. That was a little voluminous if you look at the size of some of those special education records. So the compromise with Senate Bill 408 is that a summary of performance for students with an IEP would become part of the permanent record. There's a form that ISBE is going to develop that will guide what needs to be on that summary of performance, and then there is a parent or student opt-out if those individuals don't want that information in the student's permanent record. But I think most school districts do a really good job of making sure that when the student transitions out of the K-12 setting, that parents, students have access to those IEP documents so that they're prepared as they transition to the next phase of life.
That's great. Appreciate that, Brian. How about right to play?
Right to play. So this has gotten a lot of attention. It is House Bill 3037, very narrowly passed the House with 68 votes. As Allison said earlier, you need 60 votes for the bill to pass. But what this bill would allow is the principal or athletic director to grant each student 2 waivers per year to participate in non-school activities in the sport that the student is currently participating in at school. So for example, I'll take you back to when I was in high school and had a full head of hair and could run a little faster. But when I was on the cross country team, I couldn't do a road race on a Saturday that was non-affiliated with the cross country schedule. But under this legislation, if it were to become law, the athletic director principal could, every student, 2 occasions per year, allow the student to participate in that non-school related activity during the season, the sports season, where the student is participating at school.
So the heartburn here is what does that mean? Is that a one-time instance, or does it like open it up to where if you give the waiver, it says you could run at any other event throughout the season? I know, Allison, I know you've been working on this one pretty closely and talking with various folks. I mean, do we know what the real interpretation of this is?
I mean, I think the intent of the sponsor is to have that waiver just for those one-off type events. But that's not how the bill is drafted currently. So it would still allow for that non-school athletic activity to be the exact same sport and the same season that student is potentially participating in at the school as well. So you could have a student playing, baseball, softball, and also playing club softball, baseball in the same season at the same time. So I think that that's a bit of our concern, maybe, in that it's not that narrow as it's currently drafted.
Yeah.
Yeah, the problem becomes as you rush through all these bills at top speed and have very little debate or time to comment, they have drafting errors and unintended consequences. And certainly this is a bill that needs to be cleaned up a little bit to meet the sponsor's intent.
Well, and obviously, we're trying to dictate to IHSA basically from the Capitol. And we got to remember, there's a pretty rigorous and extensive policy process that that IHSA goes through in order for these things to be handled. And this would be a more appropriate thing to go through that process, which, if there's a desire from the field for us to look at this, then maybe this needs to be introduced. But I don't know. I think we got to be very careful of the slippery slope that we're going to be on here if we start legislating more and more. And that seems to be happening here, where IHSA and athletics in particular are concerned. And so obviously we're paying close attention to that. One other thing I'll bring up besides this bill that does impact IHSA and officials, Allison, we've had a bill here for fingerprinting now, fingerprinting requirement for officials. The original legislation was that basically every school would have to deal with getting individual fingerprints from all the officials that they use, and that be done at every building. But I think we're not going to stop the fingerprinting. That is likely going to happen.
Yeah, it's in a much better spot.
Yeah, could you explain what it's looking like right now?
Sure. So House Bill 2521, it originally drafted, it would have required every school district to fingerprint the officials that were in and out of their buildings throughout the year. And you think about how many athletic events that could occur throughout the school year and how many officials that might wind up being, a huge lift for school districts to manage that. So instead, we've worked on an amendment that would require IHSA essentially to make those requests of officials, and then they receive those reports. They would also have to check the statewide sex offender and murderer databases every 5 years for those licensed officials. So, it will likely be an increased cost for officials to do that process. But instead of the district having to manage all that for the number of officials that might come in and out of their buildings and in and out of their districts for various events, all of that information would be sent to IHSA, and they have a licensing procedure already in place. And so this would be just kind of taking that name background check a step further.
Well, and I think it's worth noting, for high school principals, high school athletic directors that are looking at this, or even middle school, who use IHSA licensed officials. I used to be one years ago when I was still in college in my teaching career. I know that immediately people are like, we're going to lose more people that are going to be interested in being officials. And I would say that is a valid concern. That's one that I know Allison has communicated to the sponsor and to those involved in this. But I would say that this is one of these pieces of legislation that it's pretty easy to pass if you're in the General Assembly, because people look at this as a student safety issue. And I think that we've at least got the legislation in a much better spot than every school having to basically manage this. But what remains to be seen. And I do think, and I've had conversations with IHSA and Craig Anderson there a little bit about this bill and a few others. But we're going to need to pay attention to it, because we may have to figure out some other fixes here so that we have people that we need in order to have interscholastic events. Because I know of events that have been canceled because of lack of officials and other issues. So it's an obvious concern for us. So there's a lot more stuff we could get into, obviously, at the state level. These are some of the real big top of mind topics, and we'll continue to work with these, throughout the rest of the session. After a much needed break, right, Allison here? Yeah, because
thankfully,
these last couple of weeks have been
only the House comes back next week, so that's at least a little bit of a breather.
Kind of ease into it at least, which is helpful. But it is important, I think, here too, as we're talking about legislation and policy and everything going on. We are tracking what's happening out in DC. We know that we've had some executive orders, and Brian, I want you to chat a little bit about those. But I also want to note that that we had a request from the Department of Ed to the state superintendent and all district superintendents throughout the state, and this was happening to all of those individuals throughout the country as well. That basically we were going to attest that we were following civil rights related issues. I think it was in relationship to Title VI. Brian, is that right?
That sounds correct.
Yeah. So with Title VI, and there was an initial deadline and then another deadline to April 25th, I think was the second one that came out. They pushed that back. But Dr. Sanders has responded to that, basically stating here are the ways that we are complying with Title VI and that we're not going to sign off on that paperwork. And I think was doing that in lieu of either he or any superintendent across the state signing off on that. Now, school district superintendents are going to have to make that determination, I'm sure, with their boards and such. But that is something worth taking a look at and kind of heighten everybody's level of concern here. Now you've got the Department of Ed stating that they're not going to provide any federal funds to the state of Maine because of civil rights and DEI related issues. I think this has to do with transgender students playing in sports that are not in alignment with their birth assigned or their sex assigned at birth. So a lot of stuff to pay attention to and to be watching as we kind of assess how to deal with all of this stuff moving forward. And I don't have a great response to that other than just doing our best to try to keep everybody informed with what's going on. But I do think this brings us back to these executive orders as well, Brian, as we navigate those, because that beyond hearing things from the Department of Ed, just trying to get a sense of what is it that the president's trying to say, what is it that's really required in law, how much weight do these executive orders really carry, so on and so forth. So do you mind just walking us through that as a good reminder?
Sure, and we've talked a little bit about this in a previous edition of IPA Talk, but I think school officials in particular have been placed right in the middle of a very conservative executive branch and very liberal laws and policies in Illinois. And primarily, we've dealt with two big issues, both, as you mentioned, transgender students only being allowed to play on sports in accordance with their assigned sex at birth, and then the executive order allowing immigration officials, of course, to conduct actions at schools. So what do these mean? Are executive orders laws? And they're not laws per se. They do have legal effect in that they guide federal agencies under the executive branch, like the U.S. Department of Education. So these executive orders don't override Illinois law. They wouldn't, for example, with transgender students, they wouldn't override Illinois Human Rights Act or Illinois court cases that basically have a place for transgender students participating on sports consistent with their gender identity. But what Illinois would risk, perhaps, is funding. The president can redirect certain funds that weren't specifically designated by Congress. And then, of course, with the immigration issue, the president has the ability to direct federal officials, not state officials, but federal officials in carrying out immigration action. So these executive orders, like I said a moment ago, they aren't laws per se, but they do in some situations have the force and effect of law. So if you do have questions mainly with transgender student athletes with immigration actions at school, please contact IPA for help. Please contact your local school district's attorney, because these are complicated issues that really in many cases are without precedent.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Well, and then kind of to wrap all this up on this issue with regards to what's happening federally, you throw in the budget making process into the mix as well, and as well as whether or not the Department of Ed will truly exist or not. Which, important to note, can the administration move some of the functions of the DOE around into other departments? Yes, they can. Can they, though, unilaterally in the Department of Education? No, they cannot. That would take an act of Congress. So what they try to do under their authority will be interesting to see. I do think if they continue to move as intended, we will see a much different Department of Education, in the next couple of years to come, before a new administration were to take over. So we'll see how that part plays out. With the budget making process, we have a new continuing resolution that's to get us through for about 6 months or so. And it will be interesting to see how that impacts funding related to title grants and other IDEA funding, because I know that President and Congress have certain latitude that they can work within those parameters as well. So, time's going to tell for us to see how all of that's going to work as we get into the next school year. And I think it's going to be really important for us to all remain vigilant, and also to be talking to your members of Congress about all of this and let them know the real impact of these items on your schools, when it comes to providing services to students, and also reminding them of the economic impact. And those of you in rural school districts in particular, if these federal dollars are important to you, helping legislators understand your full FTE number of staff that you're going to have or not have, depending on federal dollars that are going to come in, and your school maybe being the largest employer in your local community, what type of impact that could have on the community as well, which could be fairly significant in certain rural parts of the state. When I think about where I'm from, there's no doubt that would have a real issue, because it's typically the smaller rural communities that are going to be most impacted by any significant cuts in funding, be it Title I, II, III, IV, you name it, as well as IDEA funding, Medicaid funding as well. School districts get a lot of Medicaid dollars for the medical services that they're providing students. So plenty of things to be paying attention to, very, very different than anything we've ever experienced. And it doesn't matter where you fall in the political aisle with regards to this stuff. These are real issues, and you're going to have to sort out, what the impact is and what it is that you feel like your school can endure. And as you talk to policymakers, giving them a clear picture of what the impact could really be, because it could be significant with regards to the services provided to kids, as well as an economic impact on your communities too. So, well, with all of that being said, I mean, I know that's a lot of reality here for us to kind of be dealing with, maybe some uncertainty to be contending with. But as we deal with that, that's where our job as leaders is, to step up and work to navigate through and pull our communities together and continue to move forward to do what's best for kids. But with all that being said, Allison, Brian, any last thoughts here before we sign it off for this IPA talk?
My bill list got a lot shorter on Friday.
Yes,
so
we'll take that. That's significant.
Yeah. That's
significant, because there were some things that we were really not excited about that fell off. You named a couple of them, but fell off the wagon, at least for now, right? Until the fall or maybe next spring. But that's good stuff. So we'll sure take that. Brian, anything from you?
I think we've covered enough.
Excellent. And I thought you were going to say something about how the Cubs are winning right now, and really doing a lot better than the Cardinals. I think I've kind of put that out of my mind. I haven't checked the standings lately, but I know it wasn't looking good there about 4 or 5 days ago. So we'll just leave it at that. All right. Okay. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it. Again, my name is Jason Leahy, here with Brian Schwartz, Allison Maley, giving you a bit of a legal legislative update. As always, if there's anything that IPA can do for you, be sure to give us a call or check us out on the web at ileprinciples.org. Take care.